hospital systems that set these types of sustainability goals for themselves, that this area of apparel and reusables and reprocessed or re-sterilized, for that matter, is a really good way to achieve those sustainability goals.
Without supplies, there's no surgery. Without products, there's no patient care. Welcome to Power Supply, the healthcare supply chain podcast focused on helping you navigate the intricacies of logistics, purchasing, contracting, and supplier relationships. Each episode, we speak with healthcare executives, supply chain leaders, and innovative entrepreneurs from across the country as they share their stories, experience, and expertise on the industry we love. From the loading dock to strategic sourcing, from buyers to the C-suite, and across the enterprise, we tackle the real-life issues impacting the healthcare supply chain. Whether you're tuning in for conversation or inspiration, we're glad you're here. You're just in time to hear it from the source and stock up on insight. So sit back and plug into Power Supply.
This week on Power Supply, we speak with Patti Hoch, VP of Supply Chain and Product Development at Ready Set Surgical in Hays. We're going to be talking, well, really a very common kind of theme, sustainability in healthcare, or building a secure supply chain with Patti today. And there's so many nuances to this, but for today's conversation, we're going to be talking about reusable versus single use, reprocessing. Well, really, the case study we're going to be talking about today is going to be gowns. So I'm interested to see how we kind of go what I would consider to be a little more swimming upstream. Seems like we've been going really heavy on single use over the last couple of decades. So if people are looking to go back in the other direction, how do they do that successfully?
Well, come on in and listen to us today, because we do address a bunch of reusable, resiliency, nearshore. We're doing a ton of stuff, and we're going to learn her favorite concert she's ever attended. So come on and join us.
We'll be right back after a short break with Patti Hoch.
I'm Hays Waldrop.
This is Garry Skinner.
And I'm Justin Poulin.
A production of 17 Studios. You're listening to Power Supply.
Joining us now is Patti Hoch, VP of Supply Chain and Product Development at Ready Set Surgical. And Patti, we got introduced through a mutual acquaintance, and really excited to have you on the show today. Why don't you tell everybody a little bit of your background before we start talking about building a secure supply chain?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me. I'm really excited to be here and sharing some of my experience with you. I have been in supply chain for 30 plus years. I started actually in the medical field. I was an MT and I was in the U.S. Army. So they kind of picked healthcare for me, and I have stayed in it and enjoyed it for the last 30 years. I started in supply chain probably 25 years ago through introduction in Six Sigma. And then I was in charge of logistics at Ohio State Wexner Medical Center. And my latest endeavor was I was the senior director of strategic sourcing, and I had value analysis and purchasing at Inova Health System in Northern Virginia. Now I'm the vice president of supply chain and product development at Ready Set Surgical, and I have my own consulting company, Gap Logic. So I'm happy to be here and talking about sustainable supply chains.
Hey, well, Patti, let me just jump in here. Unfortunately, all of our listeners that are with us right this second cannot see what we see in the background of your office there. Yeah. Can you describe what's on that wall back there? Because I think it's pretty intriguing.
That is a Grateful Dead banner from the Bertha album. So that is just a tapestry I like to keep in the background for my Zoom calls. It's usually a good conversation starter. And then I get to talk about the Grateful Dead a little bit at the beginning of each, kind of boring meeting.
How many shows?
There you go.
How many shows did you get to see?
I've been probably to over 80 shows in my lifetime.
Wow,
Yeah.
amazing.
So I
Really?
would say live music is my second passion after healthcare supply chain, which those two things don't sound like they go together, but they work well inside my life.
80 shows. Holy cow. That's impressive. I'm glad I asked.
Right.
So now we know a little bit more about you.
Right.
Well, we gotta know favorite song then at this point. She's gonna go, I love them all so much.
I'm going to say,
you gotta choose one.
I'm going to say estimated profit.
Okay.
Because
Aaron,
the song no
Aaron's
one
our
knows.
producer. We need to lay out. Yeah, exactly. I was just gonna say. So for anybody who's not a deadhead, we're gonna put a little 7 or less second sample in the background so they know what song it is, but we don't have to worry about
Correct.
FCC.
Thanks for asking. I love talking about them.
Yeah, I love music, and Hays goes to all kinds of shows, but they're usually raves.
Little X on the weekends, getting in there, Okay.
Yeah, I'm kind of bruised and battered from the last one. They dropped me.
I know.
It was kind of.
But it's boom, 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 boom.
I think about Hays like Nacho Libre coming off the top rope and just kind of doing that thing.
Yeah.
That's what I kind of see Hays right there.
That'd be a scary sight for a lot of people.
The Grateful Dead shows are sort of the opposite of raves. Everyone's kind of just in a chill vibe versus let me run into everyone and have that. It's not as high energy. Let's put it that way.
Yeah.
I can only imagine. But anyway, thanks for sharing that. 80 shows. I'm going to remember that because frankly, that might be a record for anybody I know, not only for the dead, but for anything. I hadn't watched 80 television shows, I don't think. So that's impressive.
Yeah. Let's talk about sustainability, or the way we kind of termed this one was a secure supply chain. And when I think of the word secure, I'm thinking like something we're confident in, something, that makes us just feel safe, like everything's, and that's just not how anybody in supply chain feels right now. I think there's a lot of insecurity and instability, back orders. Here we are a year later. I actually was just talking to Susie Collins the other day. I got a chance to meet up with her in Phoenix, Arizona while I was out there for a conference. And she said, it's so funny. I think it was just about a year ago that I did my interview with you all. And I was saying that, hopefully in about 12 months, the back orders will kind of be, a thing of the past. And, she's like, nothing's changed. I'm still dealing with the same amount of back orders as I always did. And so, I think we're all looking for stability and security. And I know a lot of what we're going to talk about is sustainability, but sustainability has a lot of different meanings too. And so let's anchor on that when we're talking about supply chain security for the context of today's conversation. What are we talking about, Patti?
So I look at sustainability or supply chain security rather a couple of ways. And I was in that exact same situation at Inova Health. I was in charge of sourcing when COVID started, and I immediately knew or could tell that this was going to be longer than just, the virus, which is to say that supply chain, so many parts of the supply chain were breaking down so quickly. And no one really wants to accept the responsibility of owning safety stock. So, the manufacturer doesn't want to manufacture anything more. The distributor certainly doesn't want to carry anything more. So it seems like if you want to have the right par levels or demand for your products, then for your patients, then you need to start to look at what are some other strategies you could have, because there was just no way you could rely on the manufacturer to be able to get you everything that you needed through the COVID period of time. Specifically on gowns, I think was the first sort of pain point that everybody felt was masks and gowns. And those were the things where we immediately were put on allocation. And you could tell that that allocation still is on today, just like you're saying, like this is not improved. everyone is still on allocation for disposable product.
Patti, I love how you bring up supply chain security. That's the new word. I haven't really used it much. I haven't heard that term used much, but I think it makes us think differently. Obviously, the direction is what's happened in the last 2 years is making us think more strategically, diversify. One of the questions I've asked, or I've seen asked in our arenas is, are we going back to the think tank on disposables, reusables, opportunities there where you have a spend and we've always used the disposables this way? Well, no, let's look at a little bit of an investment on something we can re-sterilize, reuse. Are you seeing a trend to evaluate some of those bits and pieces clinically? What's your thoughts, Patti?
So that was exactly what I did, actually. So as soon as I realized that this was going to be an ongoing problem, and you could see the quality of the disposable gowns that were filling that void. So, our major suppliers, they had a quality product we were really happy with, but they put us on allocation. We have way more demand than we ever had before. So that has to backfill with something. And what it backfilled with was a whole bunch of new market entries of product that didn't go through the same rigor, that didn't have to really meet hardly any standards. Infection prevention people were doing their own testing on it because you couldn't really get any kind of information about, what level does this gown really adhere to? So we went Inova. When I say we, I'm going to say Inova Health. We went back to reusables. And we used a company called La Forma Medical who manufactures sporting apparel, which was an interesting play on that. But during COVID, sports were kind of canceled too, right? So they have this great capacity to start manufacturing things and no one to manufacture for because they're making sporting goods stuff. So I think there was a lot of sort of quirky things happening during COVID that actually, when COVID started to die down, you're like, this should be something that we keep going because it's working. It's way more secure than disposable product. And what we found was that our clinical staff loved the product because it just feels more secure. So supply security could mean something else too. Secure for the clinician because they're wearing something that doesn't feel like a garbage bag. They feel like it's really protecting them. And I think that we sort of lost that because I was around for when we moved from reusables to disposables the first time, so, this isn't new. Reusables were the 70s, right? So now we're just right back to reusables, but with a different twist. There's the technology and fabrics and a whole bunch of other things have changed in a way that you can make a really nice garment that meets all the criteria. You can just wash it and you're always going to be able to just wash it again, regardless of what happens as far as pandemics or, whatever the next thing is that's coming down the pike. So I felt that the reusable solution was definitely the best solution to make sure I wasn't 2 years later dealing with the same disposable gown allocation that I had before.
Yeah, we've talked a lot about, the single use and the supply chain disruption and everything that kind of tees up the conversation around reusable. But I'd say the biggest trend in the industry was going towards single use in so many areas. And so, going back to reusable, and I think an increase on sustainable solutions, even from an environmental perspective, is a really good conversation and something that we haven't really gone down. And I know that part of that conversation we have had a number of podcasts on nearshoring, right? So how do we keep local supply lines? But to reduce the supply chain demand, using recyclable materials, whether those raw materials, can then go back in so that we don't, because the raw materials is a big issue with the shortages, right? But then also just products that are reusable. So I kind of want to go, and talk a little bit deeper about, the benefits of going to reusable. And I also want to talk about where some struggles might be for organizations, right? Like if you're a healthcare organization and you're trying to transition back and you've got this culture of a lot more single use, like what are the hurdles to overcome to start making those kinds of supply chain choices again around purchasing?
Right. So the benefits are many, but there are a couple of roadblocks that you're going to have to work through. So I think the benefits is the first thing was a really quality product. You can have things that are made out of really light materials, but still have the effectiveness of AMI 2, 3, and 4. We were looking at surgical gown reusable. And the other piece of that is the cost. So a lot of people think the reason that we went to disposables was that, oh, this is a much cheaper solution, is if we have these gowns. Well, when the disposable gowns were, pennies, that may have been the case, but I don't see disposable gowns returning to those level prices. And I think you've also seen even the manufacturers that were the quality manufacturers that we had pre-COVID have had to make adjustments to the gowns because of just the polyspun shortages and those sort of things. Like they've had to make their own material adjustments because of raw material shortages. So I think that that's one of the things that was nerve-wracking to me, was that I wasn't even sure if the manufacturers that we relied on were going to be able to get the raw materials to keep going in the long term for our facility. So we actually ended up saving money on the gowns, but it was, like I think you were saying, Gary, it is an upfront investment. So that's number one, right? So number one, it's an upfront investment to look at your usage, determine how many reusable gowns you're going to need, because, you have them in these 3 parts. I'm trying to keep my answers to 2 minutes, but it's really difficult to do that.
Well, let me jump in on this. Let me ask you a question around that. Since you're bringing up the upfront cost Gary, you brought it up. We'll give you credit where
Thank you,
credit's
Justin.
due.
Thank
brought
you.
up the
Thank you.
upfront
Oh, come
cost.
on.
It's a great point.
Look, Hays is jealous
Listen.
already. You should see he's dejected.
I'm glad this is in video for everybody to see, because as my kids used to say when they were little, that hurt my heart.
That hurt my heart.
We all love you, Hays. We all love you, brother. You're good, man.
Right.
So, Patti, how do they get over the upfront investment? I mean, everybody's starved for savings, and like the idea of savings at this point is like almost nil because inflation. We'd already squeezed everything pretty much out of the line item savings that we possibly could have. Inflation, if anything, is bringing those costs back up. They suffered a revenue loss. Like, where do they get the funding to make that kind of an upfront investment to transition? Are they essentially handcuffed at this point?
Well, certainly there are companies that are willing to let you spread that upfront cost out over a period of time, but you are going to have to bite the bullet on the upfront cost. But the good news is that with, specifically the company that we were using, we were getting 100 washes for a isolation gown, and we're getting 75 washes out of a surgical gown, and which made the break even like 2 years. But I was going to have gowns. I had enough gowns with the number of washes that I was going to have for 7-8 years. So once I hit that break even, I'm paying 30 cents a wash. So the wash is a savings at that point. And as long as you're injecting for loss and tearing and, maybe someone throws it away or whatever, a certain amount every month, you can keep that program going at a significant cost savings. And one of the bigger cost savings we had was the amount of red bag waste we took out of it was immediately noticeable that we were not throwing away, thousands and thousands and thousands of gowns in a week. And our sustainability people were actually able to put a dollar figure to how much red bag waste we were able to take out of the supply chain with the reusable gowns.
Patty, you mentioned a couple comments here, and we talk about obstacles and then options. It's like a mini SWOT analysis on every product that we look at within supply chain and how we can really focus on the important things. Patient-centered mission, as usual. That's our focus, and always working on helping with the reduction in stuff so we can take care of staff, which takes care of our patients. So one of the things that I got to ask you, that I'm thinking about this, and I don't know if we've asked this question as we evolve into this, but reprocessing. I don't know where that's at. Has that increased? Has there opportunities now where we have taken it out of the red bag and we've put it in the reprocessing bin for certain manufacturers that do this? But are we elevating our reprocessing in some of our surgery areas? Are we utilizing that more? Are you seeing that, Patty? Is that a direction or not?
So the devices that are able to be reprocessed in what I'll call more product-focused reprocessing, I just don't think has ever been adapted to the point where people thought it would be. And I think that anything that you're handing to the surgeon, there's always been some skepticism around, is this of the same quality as the new product? And even though we've put some recertifications on it, or we redo the, guarantees from certain companies who are doing that, I just don't know that has ever been adopted the way it could be. And I don't think that I've really seen anybody increasing their reprocessing in the surgical suite, but the reusable gowns and, going back to reusable lab coats and going back to, apparel, where we tried to make disposable apparel, I think is really the place where you can make a big impact, because it's just heavy and it's so much of it. Every time I go in, I put a new disposable lab coat on. Every time I go out, I throw that disposable lab coat away. Coveralls. How many times are we throwing this disposable apparel market? We're throwing thousands of those things away every day. I think we still have a lot of work to do in the reprocessing device space. I do think that it is a much easier putt to replace some of your disposable apparel with reusable apparel.
But don't you think, Patty, with a lot of the emphasis on ESG and, being environmentally sound and all those things, that this is going to move and push that faster? I mean, what do you think? I mean, it seems to me it kind of goes right in line with all that, and it's reducing a lot of your red bag waste as well.
Yes, I agree that there are a lot of institutions now that are setting pretty aggressive sustainability goals, even regardless of cost. So, we're going to take this much, reduce our trash by this much, or we're going to recycle by this much, regardless of if that's more money. And I think that hospital systems that set these types of sustainability goals for themselves, that this area of apparel and reusables and reprocessed or re-sterilized, for that matter, is a really good way to achieve those sustainability goals. There are a lot of things hospitals just can't do, but this is something they can do to make themselves more sustainable.
All right, so let's talk about some other opportunities. I know we kind of laid out a use case, with gowns specifically, but, where else can we go? I mean, you really talked a lot about apparel, head, footwear, disposable coveralls, but, one of the things I think about is the infection prevention side of that too. So the reprocessing has to be really sound to be able to do that. So on all of this apparel, to make it something that is reprocessable, what material does it have to be made out of? If you were to bring this into your supply chain, infection prevention is going to do that. I think about all the disposable scrubs in the vendor scrubs realm, right? And, recently there's been a lot of pushback on that on LinkedIn too. I've seen some posts and whatnot.
Right?
Yeah, but that's all disposable scrubs. So, how do you make something reprocessable that's going to go into a surgical area?
Well, that's one of the really interesting things that I learned, because I didn't really, until COVID, I didn't really know very much about the textile industry at all, but I certainly got schooled pretty quickly. So that was one of the great things about working with this La Forma Medical, which was La Forma Sport, is still La Forma Sports, is that, they do a lot of biking, rowing, and all of these sports that sort of have these waterproof kind of materials for sports that do things in the water or have lots of sweating and running and these sort of things, which have the same components of the things that we're looking for to repel blood or repel body fluid. So the fabric that we landed on was a fabric that was kind of like a waterproof running jacket type material that was able to essentially be waterproof and, or liquid proof, and also have the light weight to it that you would use for sport. So that's where I think that some of these companies that are focusing on what I'll call high performance medical apparel, I don't think we've ever really had that before. We had, okay, here is a really heavy cotton, hot bag for you to put over yourself so that you can be protected. And, no wonder we went to disposables. I think of even a lot of the reusables that sort of sat on the market, not really used very much pre-COVID. No one wanted to buy that stuff. It's not comfortable. It's hot. It's super expensive. And, we haven't really ever had anybody who's like thinking about this from, okay, what type of garments do high performing athletes wear? Well, okay, nurses and doctors who are in these same these really hard conditions are battling some of the same things. Fatigue of the weight of the garment, how hot it is, how long you have to wear it. And those sorts of things were just never really, I'll say there was really not that much effort put into, hey, can we make something that is good and for these types of people? And I think the translation between sports and medical works really well because they're on their feet all day too. And they're working really hard doing physical labor too.
Well, the relationships in orthopedics too, right? In orthopedics, you see a lot of that sports medicine. Everything else is played out there. A lot of the innovation has come from the sports industry in terms of surgical procedures and some of the, strategies, because the idea is to get the athletes back out there. I can definitely see a lot of that overlap though between the two. They're interconnected industries.
It'd be nice to see gowns with the Nike swish or
actually, so the company we used actually does stuff for Adidas, but when we put out the gown, that was one of the things that, because I was trying to get clinical acceptance as well, like I want these guys to really like it. So we had the Innova logo on it and other pieces, how is this designed? So one of the things we put on it was a pull cord so that it could be donned and it could be doffed individually. Because one of the pieces of feedback we had was that if I have to tie it behind my back, that I'm creating contamination. I have to have somebody else do it. So it's like a 2-person don and doffing process. So, having an opportunity to just sort of relook at this whole space and say, how can we innovate here? It was really fascinating. So the gown had a pull cord, so you could just basically rip it off the same way you can rip off a disposable. And that was a really high clinical acceptance and high clinical feedback on the weight and the fabric and the features.
All right, Patti, this time went very quick. I want to thank you so much for coming on the show. Anything you want to add before we wrap up?
No, I think this was great.
I had a blast, and it was really fun to learn all the things you talked about. But also, you've been to 80 deadhead conferences. That's incredible.
I'll never forget that.
I've been sitting here for the last 30 minutes, Patti, just thinking about that. But anyway, go ahead.
But think about this, okay? If you've been following them since, if you're 50 years old, I'm 50 years old, and I've been going to concerts since I was 18. You only have to go to 10 shows for 8 years for it to be 80 shows. And sometimes they do 3 or 4 in a row in the same location.
Wow.
So you go to all of them.
Patti, you can use that math all day. 80 shows is a lot.
Yeah.
That's what I'm.
I
don't care if you were 90 years.
Correct.
If you were 90 years old, that's still a lot of shows.
Okay.
That was Patti Hoch, VP of Supply Chain and Product Development at Ready Set Surgical. And Garry, we're talking about trying to find ways to use renewable raw materials, reusable versus single use. I feel like it's kind of against the grain. You did bring up that one area where reprocessing single use medical devices, which definitely seems like, a great opportunity for sustainability. And, a lot of times in that industry, it's just because the manufacturer hasn't really gone through the additional 510K process to make those devices reprocessable. But that doesn't mean that the quality of the product is necessarily a single-use quality. And so there's companies out there that kind of do the 510K processes after the fact, which I think is a huge opportunity. And we've got an upcoming episode where we're going to be talking about sustainability, but more on that environmental side related to chemicals and reducing the use of chemicals and chemical exposures that, can be dangerous to the environment, but also, humans can have reactions to it when they're working around those chemicals. So there's so many different meanings to sustainability, but I really like this theme of kind of taking what we're learning in the sports apparel world and maybe being able to apply that to, garments and other goods that are worn in healthcare and still achieve the same kind of level of effectiveness.
I think you're right on. It's the options. It's for supply chain security, as we talked about in the very beginning, is the diversity of options. And now with dollars and focusing on the stuff within supply chain, we've got to look at every opportunity. And some of these I'm just curious, where is reprocessing at? Have they expanded their 510K portfolio from the cath lab to the OR? The adaptability was always curious of how much they would take and what they wanted to use. But that's just really an opportunity, I think, to look at when we have shortages of raw materials. We have shortages of product. We're on a ton of allocation. Where's that at? So I'm curious from some of our listeners to see what their thoughts are, and please share with us if you know of any direction on that. So anyways, good talk with Patti. She went deep into scrubs. I think we learned a lot about scrubs, and Justin, I think you touched on that too. So good discussion for today on power supply.
Well, great point. We love feedback. And just if anybody wants to send us an email, just send it to info@powersupplymedia.net. That's going to do it for this week's show. But as a reminder, you can help support Power Supply by subscribing to us on Apple, Amazon, or Google Podcasts. You can also find us on Stitcher, iHeartRadio, Spotify, or simply search for Power Supply on your favorite podcast application. You can also access bonus content for certain episodes, but you've got to download our smartphone app for iPhone or Android. And while you're there, we'd certainly appreciate a rating and a review because your feedback is important to the show. On behalf of Hays, Garry, and myself, thank you for listening to this week's episode of Power Supply.